Okay, let's dive in. We've had requests to really unpack the Civil War in El Salvador, its origins, key moments, the whole thing.
Right. And it's crucial to remember this wasn't just El Salvador. You had similar conflicts tearing apart Nicaragua, Guatemala.
Yeah.
These were uh, terrible culminations of problems that had been simmering for ages.
Yeah, deep socioeconomic issues, political exclusion, things that had already flared up before, like in the 1969 football war or the Hundred Days War, as it's known there.
Exactly. And what makes El Salvador and these other conflicts so complex is this dual reality. You have the internal drivers, massive inequality, land issues, but then it gets caught up in the huge international dynamics of the Cold War.
So it becomes this proxy battleground, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, fighting it out through intermediaries.
Precisely. I mean, the Cold War shadow loomed large over Latin America for decades. Might help to quickly just tick off a few key examples to set the scene for El Salvador.
Good idea. Give us the context.
Okay, well, number one, the 1954 coup in Guatemala against Arbenz, democratically elected, pushing land reform, and the CIA steps in. That set a precedent.
Interventionism right from the start. What else?
Then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. That brought the nuclear threat incredibly close and really amplified the anti-communist paranoia,
Yeah, you can see how that would fuel things.
which leads directly to point three.
Yeah.
This wave of right-wing military dictatorships popping up across South America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile with Pinochet, often U.S.-backed. You even had Operation Condor, where they collaborated to hunt down dissidents across borders.
Grim stuff. And Chile pops up again, right?
Yeah, number four, the 1973 coup against Salvador Allende in Chile. Another democratically elected socialist government overthrown.
Okay, so a clear pattern of intervention and suppression of left-leaning movements.
And that leads us to point five, the final, really bloody chapter. The Central American Civil Wars. Nicaragua, Guatemala, and the focus of our deep dive today, El Salvador. These were sort of the last major battlegrounds of the Cold War in the hemisphere.
So let's zero in on El Salvador. Where do we start with its specific internal story, the roots of that inequality?
Well, El Salvador gains independence, joins the United Provinces of Central America briefly, but by 1838, it's on its own. And almost immediately, the elite, the ruling class, focuses everything on agriculture.
First indigo, then coffee becomes king. Okay.
Exactly. In the last third of the 19th century, coffee takes over. And the profits were just astronomical. Get this. Between 1880 and 1914, the value of coffee exports increased by 1,100%.
Wow, 1,100%. That kind of money changes everything.
It absolutely does. Creates an oligarchy, the coffee barons, desperate for more land to fuel those profits. They needed more and more land.
And they weren't asking nicely, I assume.
No. They took it, often forcefully, from smaller landowners, peasants. And to make it legal, in the 1880s, they actually eliminated the traditional communal land system, ejidos, which had existed for generations. This basically legalized the land grab for the elite, often called the 14 families.
So you concentrate land, wealth, and power in incredibly few hands. That's inherently unstable.
Extremely. And then you throw in a global catastrophe, the 1929 Wall Street crash. The coffee market collapses.
And guess who bears the brunt?
Always the poorest.
Yeah.
The landless peasants, the workers. They face wage cuts, job losses. Desperation sets in.
Which leads to resistance.
Yes. In 1932, you get social revolts organized partly by Agustín Farabundo Martí, a communist leader demanding, basic things, better wages, land distribution.
And the response from the state and the landowners.
Swift, brutal, and absolute. A massacre known as La Matanza, the slaughter. The military crushes the uprising. Estimates vary, but maybe 30,000 people, mostly indigenous peasants, were killed.
30,000. That's staggering. And it sends a clear message.
A terrifying message. Dissent will be met with overwhelming violence. It cemented military dominance for decades and basically drows any opposition underground.
And that name, Farabundo Martí, echoes later, doesn't it?
It does. It's no coincidence that the main leftist guerrilla coalition in the 80s called themselves the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. The memory of 32 was potent.
So the Matanza didn't solve the underlying problem, just suppressed it violently. Did the land situation improve at all?
No, it got worse. Much worse. Between 1961 and 1971 alone, the percentage of landless peasants jumped from about 12% to over 40%, 41%.
41%. Where did they go? What did they do?
Many migrated, looking for work, often to neighboring Honduras. And that massive land pressure, that migration, directly contributed to the tensions that exploded into the 100 Days War with Honduras in '69.
It's all interconnected. The land inequality keeps creating pressure points.
Constantly. And by the late 1970s, the government, under military control, basically abandoned any pretense of rule of law. In 1977, General Romero passes this infamous law, the Law of Defense and Guarantee of Public Order.
Sounds ominous. What did it do?
It essentially gave the security forces a blank check. It removed legal restraints on violence against civilians. This is when you really see the death squads ramping up their activities, disappearances, torture. Serious human rights violations become state policy.
And all this time, the U.S. is involved?
Deeply involved. Long-standing ties. Between 1950 and 72, over 1,000 Salvadoran officers trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas, notorious for training rights abusers. And military aid flowed in, about $22.5 million between 46 and 80.
Even with concerns about human rights?
Yeah, there was friction with the U.S. Congress about it, but the aid kept coming. The strategic concerns usually won out. But then comes 1979. That year changes the game. Nicaragua. The Sandinistas, backed by Cuba and the Soviets, overthrow Somoza. Suddenly, Washington is panicked. The domino theory seems real. The absolute priority becomes preventing another Nicaragua in El Salvador.
That fear really cranks up the pressure and the intervention.
Massively. And right in the midst of this escalating horror, you have this incredible figure emerge. Archbishop Oscar Romero.
He wasn't always a radical voice, was he?
No, initially seen as quite conservative, actually. But witnessing the brutality, the suffering of the poor, it changed him profoundly. He became this powerful voice for justice, very much influenced by liberation theology.
Speaking truth to power, quite literally.
Until his very last breath, his final homily, March 24th, 1980, he directly appealed to the soldiers. He said, in the name of God, in the name of the suffering people, I ask you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression.
An incredibly brave thing to say.
And he was assassinated the next day, shot while celebrating Mass. It showed the absolute impunity of the death squads. They could kill an archbishop in church and face no consequences.
Just unbelievable. How did the U.S., under Carter at this point, react to this escalation and Romero's murder?
Carter was trying this difficult balancing act.
Yeah.
Contain the leftists, but also promote human rights. He'd approved about $5.5 million in non-lethal aid. But Romero's murder shook things up.
Did it change the policy?
Temporarily. What really forced Carter's hand was later that year, the horrific rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen nuns and a lay volunteer near the airport, killed by National Guardsmen.
American citizens murdered by the forces the U.S. was supporting.
Exactly. That caused outrage in the U.S. Carter suspended all aid. But the political pressure back home was immense.
This is leading into the 1980 election.
Right. Ronald Reagan is campaigning hard, accusing Carter of being weak, of losing Nicaragua, losing Iran, letting communism advance. Under that pressure, Carter actually resumed non-lethal and then lethal aid just before leaving office. The message was clear. Stopping perceived Soviet expansion trumped human rights concerns.
And then Reagan wins. What happened?
The floodgates open. The Reagan administration saw El Salvador as the test case. Forget internal inequality. Their narrative was simple.
Yeah.
That this is Soviet-Cuban expansionism, full stop. We must stop it here.
So more money, more weapons.
Way more. In March 1981, Reagan pumps in another $25 million in military aid, and the training ramps up. The Salvadoran military swells.
And does this massive influx of aid turn the tide militarily, or does it just enable more?
More brutality.
Yeah.
Tragically, yes. One of the most infamous results was the El Mozote massacre in December 1981.
Tell us about that. The name comes up again and again.
It was carried out by the Atla Cattle Battalion, an elite unit, U.S. trained. They went into the village of El Mozote and systematically killed almost everyone. Men, women, children. Around 1,000 people.
The details that came out later, they're just sickening.
Yeah, forensic teams, mostly Argentinians with grim experience from their own dirty war, eventually exhumed bodies. They found that over half, 57% of the identified victims were children under 18. They found 136 children murdered together in the convent building. It's hard to fathom.
And yet, despite this level of violence and quadrupling the army size by the mid-80s, adding U.S. helicopters, they still couldn't defeat the FMLN guerrillas.
No. The FMLN proved incredibly resilient. They knew the terrain. They had popular support in some areas. They used guerrilla tactics effectively. The government controlled the cities and towns, but the countryside was heavily contested. It became a bloody stalemate.
Now, we have to be balanced here. The source material is clear that the government forces and death squads were responsible for the vast majority of atrocities, like El Mozote. But the FMLN weren't blameless either, were they?
No, absolutely not. It's crucial to acknowledge that. The FMLN also committed abuses. They used forced recruitment, especially of young people. They assassinated local officials, mayors, who cooperated with the government, and they used landmines extensively, which inevitably killed and maimed civilians.
I remember a specific statistic.
Yeah, in 1986 alone, FMLN landmines reportedly killed 46 civilians. So while the scale of state terror was far larger, the rebels also used tactics that harmed civilians and alienated potential supporters.
The human cost of the stalemate is just immense. You mentioned refugees earlier.
Catastrophic. Roughly 1/6 of the entire population fled the country. Think about that. By 1987, maybe 400,000 Salvadorans had made it to the U.S., forming communities in places like D.C., L.A., New York. Many others went to Mexico, Honduras, anywhere they could find safety.
Was there a single event that started to shift perceptions, especially in the U.S., about the nature of the war and the U.S. role?
I think the murder of the Jesuit priests in November 1989 was a major turning point for U.S. public opinion.
What happened there?
During a major FMLN offensive on San Salvador, soldiers from the same Atlacatl battalion, the El Modo unit, went into the University of Central America and murdered 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her teenage daughter. 5 of the priests were Spaniards, but their connection to U.S. academic circles in the church was strong.
Killing priests, academics, at a university, that's hard to spin as combat.
Impossible. It starkly revealed the brutality of the U.S.-funded military to an American audience that maybe hadn't been paying close attention. It became much harder for politicians to ignore the human rights situation.
And around the same time, there was an admission of military failure.
Yes, in early 1990, a senior U.S. military officer, General Maxwell Thurman, told the U.S. Congress quite plainly that the Salvadoran military, despite all the aid and training, was not capable of defeating the FMLN.
So the military solution wasn't working. The human rights costs were becoming undeniable. What finally pushed things towards peace? Because talks had failed before.
Right. Talks in 84, 87. They failed because one side or the other, usually the government, still believed they could win militarily. What changed around 1990 was a convergence of factors, mostly external.
The big one being
The end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall falls in 89. The Soviet Union is crumbling. Suddenly, El Salvador's geostrategic importance to the U.S. plummets. The whole stopping communism rationale just evaporates.
and the domino effect fear.
Gone. Especially after February 1990, when the Sandinistas unexpectedly lost the election in Nicaragua. The regional threat, as perceived by Washington, disappeared.
So less reason for the U.S. to keep pouring money in.
Exactly. Congress started putting more conditions and restrictions on aid. Plus, U.S. attention shifted the invasion of Panama in 89, at the first Gulf War kicking off in 1991. El Salvador just wasn't the priority anymore,
The external pressure cooker was turned off?
which finally allowed space for serious negotiations. The UN stepped in to broker talks starting April 1990. A ceasefire was finally agreed upon in September 1991.
And that led to the final agreement.
Yes, the Chapultepec Peace Accords, signed in Mexico City in January 1992, ending 12 years of brutal civil war.
What were the key components of those accords? What changed?
Some major institutional reforms. The hated National Guard, the Treasury Police, these repressive forces were abolished.
Yeah.
A new civilian police force was created, integrating some ex-guerrillas and ex-soldiers.
And the FMLN.
They formally demobilized as an armed group and became a legal political party, which they still are today, a major force in Salvadoran politics.
And accountability. Was there an effort to address the horrific abuses?
There was. A Truth Commission was set up in July 92, under the UN, to investigate the worst violations committed by both sides during the war.
What did it find?
Its report, released in March 1993, was damning. It concluded that the state forces, the army, the security forces, the death squads, were responsible for the overwhelming majority, something like 85% of the abuses, including massacres like El Mozote and the Jesuit murders. It named specific officers.
So justice was served.
Well, here's the gut punch. Just 5 days after the Truth Commission report came out, the Salvadoran legislature, dominated by the right-wing Arena Party, passed a blanket amnesty law.
A blanket amnesty for everyone.
Pretty much. It shielded perpetrators of wartime atrocities on both sides, but primarily benefiting the military leadership named in the report from prosecution. Justice was sacrificed for, supposedly, stability.
So the people responsible for the worst crimes walked free.
For a very long time, yes, it created this deep wound, this sense of impunity. It wasn't until July 2016, think about that, 23 years later, that El Salvador's Supreme Court finally declared parts of that amnesty law unconstitutional.
3 years.
Only then could the possibility of prosecuting these decades-old war crimes even begin, a very long shadow.
So tracing it all back, From that 1100% coffee boom creating an oligarchy, through the Matanzas silencing dissent, then becoming a brutal Cold War proxy fight with atrocities like El Mozote, ending with a peace driven by shifting geopolitics.
And an amnesty that protected the powerful. It's a story with immense tragedy, especially for the civilian population who pay the highest price, hundreds of thousands displaced, tens of thousands killed.
And the so what here seems to be about accountability, right? The Truth Commission pointed fingers mainly at the army, but also acknowledged FMLN violence. But the peace deal prioritized ending the fighting over immediate justice.
Exactly. The war ended not because one side won or because of a sudden moral reckoning, but because the international sponsors, mainly the U.S., lost interest as the Cold War wound down.
Yeah.
The external drivers stopped driving.
Okay, so for our final thought. The source material mentions a monument built after the war dedicated to peace, hope, and justice. If this whole conflict arguably started because a tiny elite wouldn't share the wealth from that coffee boom, and it ended with an amnesty law shielding those implicated in maintaining that system through violence, what does that 23-year delay and even allowing trials tell us about which force ultimately won out? Was it peace? Or was it the preservation of certain power structures, even after the guns finally went silent? Something to think about.